Some documents weren't lost to the passage of time, and they weren't destroyed in a fire or swept away in a flood like so much old paperwork usually is. They were filed away on purpose, tucked into folders that sat behind other folders, and slipped into drawers that nobody had any reason to open, which is a choice rather than an accident. What I'm going to tell you about today is known as Dossier Number Four, a physical document compiled by a circuit court judge back in 1891. It sat misfiled in a Tennessee county courthouse for more than 60 years before anyone outside that building even knew it existed. And that kind of silence is rarely a mistake. Before we go any further, I want you to tell me where you are listening from by dropping it in the comments below. If you happen to be in Tennessee, Kentucky, or anywhere in the Appalachian Hill Country, you should pay closer attention than you normally would, because this story is about land you might actually know. The dossier describes a family, not a creature, or a ghost, or some half-formed thing out of folklore, but a real family, across 3 generations, who lived inside a cave system in the hollows south of the Cumberland Plateau. In the autumn of 1889, they used song to pull travelers off the road and into the dark along a stretch of trail that locals had quietly stopped using without being able to give a reason anyone could write down. The man who first documented the hollow was a county land surveyor named Aldous Crane, who was 44 years old in the autumn of 1889 and possessed a broad chest and a surveyor's habit of writing everything down. His cramped, careful hand filled every inch of his notebooks, and having worked these mountains for 19 years, he knew the soil type by the color of the creek runoff and which ridge lines carried the wind. He knew the difference between a farmer who was being quiet and a farmer who was being careful. And because he wasn't a man who frightened easily, he had very little patience for the kind of fear that passed itself off as local wisdom. His assignment involved the disputed timber boundary in the hollows south of Crossville, which was routine work he had performed dozens of times over the years. He set out expecting nothing that would take more than 3 days, but the road south felt wrong before he could even put a name to the sensation. It wasn't washed out or overgrown or blocked, but it felt wrong the way a path through the woods feels when it hasn't carried weight in a long time, even though the surface shows no sign of it. The packed earth was solid, and the tree line was clear on both sides, yet something in the quality of the quiet was off, and Crane made sure to write that detail in his field notes before he had gone a half-mile. He stopped at a farmstead to confirm the route and met a farmer who was somewhere in his 60s, a lean man who was deliberate in the way men get when they have spent decades making careful decisions. Crane named the hollow he was heading toward and asked if the road through was passable, but the farmer didn't answer him directly. Instead, the man gave Crane a different route that was longer by about 4 miles and claimed it was easier going. And when Crane asked what was wrong with the original road, the man looked at a spot somewhere past Crane's left shoulder and said nothing at all. Crane wrote that look down too. Then he took the original road anyway, because that is what the job required, and he had never yet let another man's silence become his problem. The road bent south and dropped into the hollow around 4:30 in the afternoon, and while there was still plenty of light, the sun sat just high enough above the ridge that the tree canopy hadn't yet gone dark. Crane was working his way along the limestone face to his left while taking notes on the boundary markers, and that was exactly when the sound reached him. He wrote later that he almost didn't recognize it as a sound at first, describing it more like a pressure that occupied the same part of the mind that processes music without quite being music. 3 notes, maybe 4, cycled in a slow pattern that felt like it was almost resolving into something recognizable before it pulled away again. It was like a hymn you'd heard once as a child and couldn't quite pull all the way forward into your memory, which made it close enough to familiar that your brain kept reaching for it, but not close enough to ever actually arrive. He checked his compass out of habit and wrote down the time as 4:47 in the afternoon. There was no wind, and while the creak to his right was audible, it sounded distant and thin. He stood still for a full minute, trying to fix a direction on the sound, but he simply couldn't, because it seemed to come from inside the rock face itself, or perhaps from somewhere below it. The tone rose up through the limestone, rather than travelling across open air the way sound normally does, and there was no point source he could locate. It was just there, everywhere and nowhere at once, sitting in the hollow like something that had always existed. Then he followed it. That is the part of his field notes that reads the strangest, because Crane was never the kind of man who wandered off his task for a whim. He followed the sound for what he later estimated was 60 or 70 yards, moving off the road and into the thick leaf litter at the base of the rock face, before something finally pulled him up short. He wrote that he became aware of having walked some distance without ever deciding to do so, and he left it at that. There was no panic in his phrasing, and no drama in the telling, just the flat observation of a man who recorded what he saw and left the interpretation for later. He stepped back onto the packed earth of the road, and the sound stopped instantly. It didn't fade out or diminish with distance, but instead it stopped the way a voice stops when a heavy door is swung shut. He finished his notes for the day and rode back to Crossville. That night at the boarding house, which was a 2-story place on the main road, run by a woman named Mrs. Adele Pruitt, he asked about the hollow by name over his supper. He described where he'd been working and mentioned the limestone face near the bend in the road, south of the 3rd Creek crossing. And that was when Mrs. Pruitt set down the serving bowl she was holding. She didn't pick it back up for a long moment, but then she looked at him directly and told him he didn't go in. It wasn't a question, and Crane made sure to write it down exactly that way in his records. He told her no, he hadn't gone in anywhere and had stayed on the road the whole time, and she nodded like that was the only correct answer to a question she'd been dreading. He pressed her on what she meant by that, so she told him, very carefully, the name that the people around Crossville used for whoever or whatever lived in those caves. The Vaults. She said it wasn't a real family name, but just what people called them because of where they kept themselves. She didn't say another word about it after that, and she didn't come back to the table for the rest of the meal. Before I tell you what Crane found when he went back, I want to take a moment to tell you where you're hearing this. This is the Echoes of the Hollow, and what we do here is pull up the files that got buried, the accounts that got misfiled or restricted, or quietly set aside, and we read them out loud. If you're hearing this on some other channel, you should know that they lifted our content without permission, so please report them for us if you can. Now let's get back to Dossier Number 4, because what the document actually says about what Crane found is much worse than anything the locals told him. Judge Harlan Obie compiled this dossier in 1891, which was 2 years after Crane's survey was finished. Obie was a circuit court judge out of Cumberland County, and a very careful man by reputation. The kind of official who didn't put his name on a document unless he was sure it could withstand a lot of scrutiny. He pulled together Crane's field notes, along with written accounts from 3 other individuals who'd had contact with the hollow, a letter from a physician in Nashville who'd examined one of the witnesses, and direct testimony from a woman who had gotten close to the cave entrance and managed to get away. He organized all of it and numbered the pages, then wrote a summary at the front in very dense and precise legal language. The dossier opens with a physical description of the cave entrance that was drawn from Crane's notes and backed up by two other accounts. It was low and wide, partially hidden under a limestone overhang that would shade it from above and make it invisible from the road unless you already knew exactly where to look. Crane described the smell as he got close as a mix of cold water and old smoke, but there was something beneath both of those that he wrote he could not name. It wasn't decay exactly, but it was something older than decay, the kind of smell that made you think of places that hadn't moved any air in a very long time. The first chamber inside the entrance showed signs of people living there going back for years. There were fire rings blackened deep into the stone floor, and the carbon was worked so far into the rock that Obi estimated they'd been in use for decades. He found sleeping pallets made from bark sheets and packed moss that had been worn smooth from long use, and stacked along the near wall was a collection of bones that the dossier is careful to call animal remains. These were deer and smaller things, the leavings of people who ate what the forest gave them, but the walls were the real mystery. Covering most of the available surface in the chamber were marks that Obi's dossier describes as not being writing, but not being decoration either, but rather a system of some kind, possibly numerical, arranged in rows that suggest deliberate record-keeping. Obi concluded there were 7 individuals living there across 3 generations. There was an elderly woman the accounts referred to only as the grandmother, along with adults of working age and at least 2 children who were as young as 5 or 6 years old. They were a family by every ordinary measure, people who cooked and slept and kept some kind of record on their walls, and they had been doing all of it in that cave for at least 30 years. It was likely longer than that, because the limestone formations had begun to grow around the base of their hearthstones, and that takes years of accumulated mineral deposits to happen. That is the kind of slow geological clock that doesn't lie about how long something has been sitting still. The songs were not accidental. That's what the Nashville physician's note establishes, and it's the part of the dossier that sits heaviest once you understand what he's actually saying. The physician had some formal musical training, which was enough for him to attempt a transcription of the intervals as multiple witnesses described them to him. His note, which is included in full in the dossier, concludes that the pattern of notes was consistent across every account he reviewed, and it was consistent enough to rule out any coincidence. He found that the specific intervals chosen had an acoustic property he found difficult to explain, because the sound was shaped to travel through limestone. It was designed to move upward through fissures and hairline cracks in the rock and emerge on the surface as something sourceless and ambient, something that seemed to come from everywhere at once and could not be assigned a direction. He wrote that no untrained person would ever know how to engineer something like that. He didn't follow that observation with any explanation of how the family might have learned it, or where such knowledge could have come from in the first place. Obi didn't follow up on it either. He simply included the note and moved on to the next section of the dossier, and this is where his language starts to change. Obi's dossier cross-references 7 different disappearances along that hollow road between the years of 1871 and 1889, and every single one of them was a traveller. None of these people were locals, and none of them were headed to any destination nearby, but were simply passing through the way folks do when the road happens to cut through the hills. There were merchants, a circuit preacher, and even a pair of brothers moving west to find work. All of them people with somewhere to be, who simply never arrived. The pattern held steady across all 7 cases, with every disappearance happening in that narrow window between late afternoon and early evening. That is the hour when the light starts pulling sideways through the trees, and the hollows go dark much faster than the open country above them, leaving a traveler in a world of shadows. Every victim was either alone or traveling in a pair, and in 3 of those 7 cases, the horses or mules were found the following morning, still standing on the road. They were still hitched to their wagons, loaded and patient and going nowhere, just standing there, as if they were waiting for a command that was never going to come. Whatever had happened to the people who had been driving them, the animals had refused to follow. That particular detail appears in Obi's summary without any extra comment, as he lists it in the same plain sentences he uses for everything else before moving on. But it is the kind of detail that sticks in your mind once you have read it, because an animal that won't follow its owner is usually trying to tell you something important. Animals generally go where they are led, and where they feel safe, and those mules had decided on their own that they were not going wherever that road went next. The clearest account in the entire dossier belongs to a woman identified only as M. Alcott, a 31-year-old school teacher who is traveling alone towards Sparta. Her testimony runs for 4 pages in Obi's file, which is longer than any other single account, because she was the only one who got close enough to see the inside and still got away to talk about it. She first heard the singing around 5 in the afternoon on a stretch of road she didn't recognize from her previous trips, and she described it the same way Crane did. It was a cycling pattern that felt almost like a melody, but never quite landed on one, creating something that felt more like a memory than a physical sound. She said she became aware that she was moving toward the rock face to the left of the road before she ever consciously decided to move, but she wasn't being dragged or pushed. She used the word invitation, writing in the account Obi transcribed that it felt like it wasn't a matter of compulsion, but rather an invitation, as though something inside of her already knew the way. What finally stopped her was the smell, because the moment she reached the shadow of the limestone overhang, the cold hit her and brought a scent Crane had also noted. It was an old smoke and deep water smell, with something else beneath it she couldn't quite name, and her body recoiled before her reasoning mind could even catch up. She took 2 steps back, and the sound seemed to adjust or shift slightly, the way a voice changes when it is trying a different approach to get what it wants. Then she turned and ran, and she didn't stop until she reached a farmhouse 2 miles east of where she had been standing. Her testimony is the only account in the dossier that describes the mechanism with any real clarity, and she insisted that the songs were not threatening at all. That is the part she kept returning to, and rephrasing as though she needed Obi to understand it precisely, because to her, they weren't frightening. They were comforting, sounding like something she had heard long ago in her life, something she couldn't attach a specific memory to, but could still feel in her bones. It was the feeling of being somewhere safe and small, back before she was responsible for anything in the world. Obi added a note in the margin of her testimony, in a different ink, which means he likely added it later, after he had reviewed the other accounts he collected. The note says that 3 others described this same quality, noting that the sound does not alarm, but instead, it reminds. He underlined those last 2 words, and it is the only place in the entire dossier where Obi underlined anything at all. 7 people walked off that road between 1871 and 1889 and never came back. But M. Alcott was the one who walked back to the world. The only difference the dossier can find was a smell she couldn't name, and a body that flinched before her mind ever gave it permission to move. Crane went back the next morning with a chain carrier named Doss Pell, but he hadn't told Pell a single thing about what he had heard the day before. He wanted a clean reaction from a man who had no reason to be listening for anything in particular, hoping to see if a fresh set of ears would pick up the same haunting melody. They reached the hollow around mid-morning, when the light was coming in flat and white through the canopy, and the creek was running loud to the east. For the first hour there was nothing unusual to report, just the sound of their equipment and the scratch of Crane's pencil against the paper. The limestone hollow had a particular silence that held sound differently than open country, absorbing the noise rather than letting it carry across the hills. Pell worked the chain without saying a word, and Crane took his measurements and wrote them down just like any other day. Then Pell stopped dead in his tracks. He stood still for a moment with his head tilted slightly to one side, the way a man stands when he is trying to hear something more clearly without admitting he is listening. Then he asked, without even turning around, if Crane could hear that hymn playing. Crane wrote later that the word stopped him cold, not because it was wrong, but because it was exactly the right way to describe it. That is what it sounded like. Something with the shape and the weight of a hymn, like the slow cycling pattern of a song built to be sung by many voices in a room with stone walls. But neither of them could name the tune, even though Crane ran through every hymn he knew well enough to hum. The notes were close to familiar, and then they weren't, which is the same quality every account describes, as the music is always arriving almost, but not quite. They didn't go to the entrance because Crane had made that decision before they even left Crossville that morning, and he stuck to his guns. He set up his equipment where he needed it to be, and worked while Pell worked alongside him. But Crane noticed that Pell kept drifting as the hours went by. It wasn't dramatic, or even something Pell seemed aware of, but he would take a few steps here and there in the direction of the rock face. Once he got nearly 10 feet away before Crane called his name, and Pell turned around, with the confused look of a man who had lost his place in the middle of a sentence. Around 2 in the afternoon the sound shifted, and this time Crane was the one who noticed it first. The notes dropped into a lower register, and the cycling slowed down. And he spent that night trying to find the right way to describe the change in his journal. What he finally settled on was that it was the difference between a question and a statement, because the morning sound had been reaching out, but the afternoon sound had decided something. They packed their equipment and left the hollow, and Pell didn't speak a single word on the entire walk back to where the horses were tied. Crane didn't push him on it, but he wrote his notes that evening in the boarding house, and the last line of that day's entry says he did not think they were trying to frighten anyone. He believed they were trying to welcome them. There was one more thing the dossier lists without much surrounding language, which is the way Obi lists the things he doesn't quite know how to handle. Near the cave entrance, not inside it, but within 20 feet of the overhang, Crane found a leather satchel half buried under a season's worth of fallen leaves. He worked it free from the dirt and opened it to find the contents were still completely intact. There were papers, a folding knife, a change of linen, and a small amount of money in coin, along with one folded bill. The satchel matched the description of one belonging to a dry goods merchant named Reuben Say, who had been reported missing in the autumn of 1882. Everything he had carried was still there, including his money, which meant that robbery wasn't the motive. Whatever had pulled Reuben Say off that road, he had simply set his bag down at the entrance and walked away from it without taking a single thing he owned. The hollow had kept it for 9 years, just waiting, the way the rest of that cave had been waiting, patient and unhurried and certain of its welcome. Judge Obi was not a man who moved with any particular haste. He spent the better part of 1890 gathering his accounts and checking dates, writing letters to the physician in Nashville and to Crane, and eventually reaching out to the county sheriff. That sheriff was a man named Lowell Fitch, someone who had heard the whispers about the hollow for years, but had filed them away in that dark corner of the mind where officials keep things they would rather not look at too closely. By the time 1891 rolled around, Obi decided he could no longer let the matter rest. So he pulled together a small group to hike out to the cave and see exactly what was waiting for them. The party consisted of 5 men, including Sheriff Fitch, 2 of his deputies, and Crane himself. Obi also brought along a Methodist minister named Silas Broughton, because he valued the man's steady eyes and wanted a witness who wasn't beholden to the politics of the local court. They made their move on a Tuesday morning in March, when the spring light was clear and the ground had dried out enough to make the trek without much trouble. When they finally stepped inside, they found the cave was entirely empty. It wasn't just abandoned or tossed around, but empty in the specific way a room feels when the people living there have only stepped out for a moment. The fire in the main chamber had burned down to a bed of coals that were still throwing off a noticeable heat, and Fitch actually held his hand over the embers and made sure to note that detail in writing later on. The sleeping pallets were still laid out and smoothed over, and the stacks of food and supplies along the wall hadn't been touched at all. Whatever warning reached that family must have come fast enough to make them leave everything behind, yet they still had enough time to bank the fire before they vanished into the dark. Broughton spent an hour hunched over the markings on the walls, scribbling as many as he could into a small notebook he'd carried for the task. His later contribution to Obi's dossier is careful and sounds a bit unsettled, which is strange for a man known for having such a level head. He wrote that several of the symbols reminded him of things he had seen in ancient texts and theological volumes, including a manuscript he had once handled in a seminary library back in Virginia. These weren't Cherokee symbols, or any European alphabet he recognized, and he admitted he couldn't say what tradition they belonged to, or what story they were trying to tell. He did note that some rows seemed to follow a base 12 counting system, though he was honest enough to say he might just be seeing patterns where there were none. The deeper chamber is where Obi's usually detailed writing suddenly goes quiet. Up until this point, he had been a precise and thorough record keeper who never skipped a detail just because he didn't understand it, preferring to qualify his statements rather than leave things out. In this section, however, he lists the group's findings in short, flat sentences that offer no measurements or the kind of cross-references he used everywhere else in the file. He simply wrote that he chose not to include a full accounting in the document because he didn't believe there was any purpose that could justify doing so. That was it, just one single sentence to cover the end of the search. Whatever Obi and those 4 other men saw in the back of that cave stayed with them, and he made a conscious choice to keep that secret for the rest of his life. His formal recommendation reached the county court within the month, and it was as final as a closing door. He suggested they seal the cave entrance with mortared stone, reroute the nearby road, and record the 7 disappearances as having an unknown cause, with no further investigation needed. He filed the dossier under restricted access, which meant it was tucked into a drawer behind other drawers, where it was quickly forgotten as the county moved on to other things. The very last line Obi ever wrote in that dossier says that the family has not been found, and he does not expect they ever will be. He ended the thought by saying he suspected they had simply moved deeper into the earth. The mouth of the cave was finally sealed, in the winter of 1891, by a crew of men who used heavy stone and mortar to block the opening under the limestone ledge. The road leading south out of Crossville was quietly moved to a new path, and the surveyors drew the line far enough away from the hollow that no traveller would ever be within earshot of that rock face again. There was never a public announcement or an official reason given for the change, as the county simply stopped fixing the old stretch of road until the brush and briars reclaimed the path by 1895. For about 15 years, the hollow stayed silent, and nothing came back out of the woods. That changed in the autumn of 1906, when a group of hunters was working the ridges 2 miles south of the sealed cave, and stopped dead in their tracks. One of the men noticed a sound coming up through the ground beneath his boots, and it wasn't traveling through the air, but vibrating right through the stone itself. It was 3 slow, cycling notes rising out of a thin crack in the limestone shelf where they were standing. When the men scrambled off the ledge, the sound didn't cut out instantly like it had for Crane years before, but instead it kept ringing for another minute, as if it took a moment to realize the audience was gone. One of the men in that hunting party was a hardware merchant named Elbert Kane, and he was the sort of person who couldn't let a mystery sit without poking at it. Once the party made it back to town, Kane sat down and wrote a letter to the county court, asking if there was any record of a family living in the cave country south of Crossville. He explained exactly what they had heard, and gave the location of the limestone shelf, hoping someone could tell him what was going on out there in the woods. The court clerk sent a response back within 2 weeks, but the letter was brief and didn't offer any real answers. This wasn't because the clerk was trying to hide the truth, but because he had actually looked through the files and found absolutely nothing. The restricted status Obie had placed on the dossier worked so well that the document had basically ceased to exist as far as the courthouse staff was concerned. Both of those letters still exist today, with Kane's question and the clerk's empty answer sitting just 3 pages apart in the same small archive. Dossier Number 4 had been sitting in that building the entire time, hidden in plain sight, while people asked questions it could have answered. Crane's personal field notes took a much different path through history. He kept his journals until the day he died, and in the early 1930s, his daughter decided to donate his survey records to a small historical society in Cumberland County. She included a cover letter explaining that these were his professional records, though she made sure to mention that her father had asked the family never to read some of them. The society catalogued the journals and put them on a shelf, but that warning about keeping the pages closed never made it into the official records. The dossier itself didn't surface again until 1952, during a boring reorganization of the courthouse storage rooms. A records clerk found the file, tucked away behind some old documents from a land dispute that happened in 1887, which was 2 years before the events in the hollow even started. No one can say for sure how it ended up misfiled in that specific spot, but the clerk realized he was holding something strange and managed to photograph several pages before his supervisor told him to put it back. He did as he was told, but the photos he had already snapped went home in his jacket pocket that evening. Those few photographs are the reason we know anything about Dossier Number 4 today. They are mostly partial pages, and some of the images are blurred, but none of them show the section where Obie described the deeper chamber. Whatever it was that the judge chose to keep out of the light, those pages weren't among the ones the clerk managed to save. That gap in the story has always been there, and it remains the most haunting part of the entire record. The family mentioned in the dossier has no name, and no census record from before or after 1889 accounts for a single one of them. You won't find them in a court filing, a tax record, or a church register, despite 7 people across 3 generations living in a cave system south of Crossville for 30 years. Not a single document outside of Obi's restricted file acknowledges they ever existed, which suggests this was either a family that went to extraordinary lengths to stay hidden, or something much harder to explain. The songs are documented in the file, but never explained, leaving us to wonder if they were learned from something older, or passed down through a lineage that predated their time in that cave. They might have been worked out deliberately over decades of isolation, much like any skill develops when a person has nothing but time and a specific problem to solve. The physician's note about the acoustic engineering sits in the file without any follow-up, and the fact that a careful man like Obi read it and wrote nothing in response tells you more than a reaction ever could. Then we have the bones in the deeper chamber that Obi chose not to describe, and while that choice belonged to him, the silence itself acts as a kind of description. A circuit court judge who had spent 20 years looking at crime scenes and the ordinary wreckage of human lives in rural Tennessee decided, in the back of that cave, that he was going to write one sentence and stop. You can sit with that for a moment. I want to know if you have ever been somewhere in a hollow or the woods where the terrain goes quiet in a specific way, and you heard something that felt less like a sound and more like a direction. It's the kind of thing that makes you take a step or two toward it before you even catch yourself doing it. If you've spent time in the Cumberland Hill Country, or anywhere that landscape folds down into limestone, tell me about it in the comments, because I want to know where people are when these stories find them. If you have a story that sounds like it belongs in a dossier, you should send it in, because that is exactly how this channel stays alive. Obi sealed that cave and rerouted the road before burying the file, and when a clerk refiled it in 1952, the photographs that survived didn't include the pages that would answer the questions you have right now. If the dossier is right about its last line, something moved deeper into the limestone south of Crossville the moment that entrance was sealed. It has been moving deeper for a long time, but if the physician was right about those songs being shaped to travel upward through rock, then depth was never the point. Depth is just where you go when you are waiting to be heard again.